The egoic self is never satisfied. It's always finding something else to chase after and acquire. Its cravings are bottomless, and the ego is notoriously insatiable. Hi everyone, and welcome to Journey of Self-Awareness, your YouTube channel for personal growth and self-exploration. In this video, we're going to talk about the sense of a separate, egoic self, which is the main source of consternation and suffering in people's lives. The egoic self is a set of beliefs that we're a separate, individual entity, distinct from the rest of the universe. These beliefs are based on our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, which we identify as being me or mine. Now, the ego is really simply a mental construct. It's often described as a false self, because it's not our true nature. It's merely a conceptual fabrication that we identify with. The egoic sense of a separate self is a necessary part of human development. It arises partly as a defense against perceived injustices, and it helps us to learn and grow and to interact with the world around us. However, it can also be a source of suffering. When we become attached to our thoughts, feelings, and experiences, and when we believe that they are who we really are. Or we may identify with our thoughts, our emotions, our possessions, or our accomplishments. We can also identify with the body. However, these things are not who we really are. We are actually the awareness that experiences these things. Thus, the ego is based on a false sense of identity. It's a sense of being a separate self, which is also false. We may see ourselves as separate from others, from nature, and from the universe. However, we're all interconnected. We're all part of the same oneness. When we identify with our ego, we see the world through the lens of our own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. We judge others, we compare ourselves to others, and we become attached to our own ideas of what is right and wrong. This can lead to negative feelings such as anger, resentment, and fear. As I mentioned, identification with the false sense of self is a primary source of suffering. Some of the main ways that ego causes suffering are through attachment, comparison, and fear, as I mentioned. Attachment happens when we identify with our thoughts, beliefs, and emotions, and we become attached to them. When they're threatened or challenged, we can experience suffering. For example, if we feel we're not good enough and someone criticizes us, we may feel hurt or angry. Our sense of self is tied up with this belief, and when it's challenged, our ego can feel threatened. The egoic self creates a false sense of security by telling us that we need to be successful, loved, and in control. Or it'll tell us we need more material possessions, social status, or fame. The ego is never satisfied. It's always seeking approval, striving for wants and desires such as money, love, fame, status, or power. It tells us that if we can achieve enough of the right things, we'll be happy and fulfilled, which can sometimes lead to greed or envy. But no matter how much we acquire, it'll never be enough. The egoic self is never satisfied. It's always finding something else to chase after and acquire. Its cravings are bottomless, and the ego is notoriously insatiable. On top of that, the ego is constantly comparing itself to others, which can lead to feelings of insecurity, inferiority, anxiety, or resentment. The ego also seeks pleasure, but sometimes in the pursuit of pleasure, it causes people to run headlong into their own suffering. That is, seeking pleasure and happiness or a sense of fulfillment, people often unwittingly act in ways that actually increases their suffering. as in the case of drug addiction, for example. Fear is another way the ego causes suffering. The ego is often driven by a fear of loss or the unknown, seeking approval and fearing failure. It's often afraid of being rejected, unloved, or alone, which can also cause anxiety, stress, and worry. Ultimately, the ego primarily fears the possibility of its own death, but as a mental construct, the ego has nothing to fear, for it can never really die or be destroyed. Being entangled in a sense of a separate self is a bit like being in a car where the ego's in control and driving us all over the place. But no matter how hard we might try to kick the ego out of the car, we can never really succeed. It'll always be with us to some extent. About the best we can hope for is to get the ego to relax enough to sit in the back seat and let us drive the car so we can decide where to go. But even then, we always need to be attentive because the ego is very often looking for a way to jump back up into the front seat and start driving again. In addition to attachment, comparison, and fear, the egoic self causes suffering through aversion and the avoidance of pain and discomfort. Aversion refers to our tendency to push away or avoid experiences or situations that we perceive as unpleasant or undesirable. Such situations can include physical pain, of course, emotions, or external events. However, avoidance can create a cycle of reactivity that amplifies the intensity and duration of our suffering. For example, when we experience a headache, our egoic self might generate thoughts that reinforce the aversion, such as, "This is terrible," or "I can't stand it." People often ruminate on such thoughts, which can just amplify the intensity of the pain and make it worse. Similarly, when we experience rejection, the egoic self can generate thoughts such as, "I'm not good enough," or "I'll never be loved," which can lead to a sense of hopelessness and despair. By identifying with desires and aversions, the egoic self creates a narrow and limited perspective. It prevents us from seeing the full picture of our lives and our journey. And such a narrow perspective reinforces the illusion of separation from others and the world around us, ultimately leading to more suffering. When we begin to understand the immense suffering caused by the ego, we should become fully committed to liberating ourselves from the tyranny of a separate self. That is, we should become fully committed to making sure the ego assumes its proper position in the back seat of the car where it can serve us instead of the other way around. Living in a me-centered universe traps us in the stream of our own thoughts, emotions, and beliefs, ultimately preventing us from experiencing the fullness of life. It's like riding an untamed stallion that's constantly running off in all directions without our control. And being caught up in the separate self keeps us from realizing our true nature. However, there's a positive side to all this. Because our constant focus on the self and on our own needs, desires, and preferences means that every experience presents an opportunity for growth and self-realization. A person enmeshed in the ego is always viewing everything that happens in terms of its impact on them, on the self. It directs our attention to certain things. And because this constant preoccupation with self is always directing our attention, we can use our reactions to everything that happens to us as food for growth. It's as if the universe is constantly providing us with everything we need to awaken and become self-aware. But first, we must learn to really relax and pay attention to our thoughts and emotions. Otherwise, all we'll continue to see is a reflection of our own thoughts and constructs. To alleviate suffering caused by the egoic self, it's critically important to cultivate mindfulness and awareness of our experiences in each moment. By observing our thoughts and emotions without judgment or resistance, we can begin to interrupt the cycle of reactivity and create space for insights to arise. Mindfulness, meditation, and daily practices can help reduce the intensity and duration of egoic suffering, and they ultimately support a greater sense of peace and well-being in our lives. In future videos, we'll learn about specific practices like self-inquiry, surrender, and selfless service to others. Such practices can help us identify and challenge negative thought patterns, develop constructive ways of thinking, and cultivate empathy and compassion for others. Through self-inquiry and self-awareness, we can begin to let go of our attachments to the egoic self and cultivate a deeper sense of connection with our true nature. And when we finally let go of our ego, we can see the world from a more objective perspective. We can appreciate the beauty and wonder of the universe and connect with others on a deeper level. We can also experience a sense of peace and freedom, knowing that we're not limited by our thoughts, feelings, and experiences. We can begin to see the universe not as something separate from ourselves, but as an intimate reflection of our own consciousness. We can begin to see the universe as a supporting force that's constantly guiding us towards self-realization and growth. In conclusion, through mindfulness practices, we can cultivate a sense of detachment from our habitual patterns of thinking and feelings that arise from being preoccupied with the self. We can free ourselves from suffering and cultivate a deeper sense of connection and fulfillment in our lives. Instead of endlessly struggling against the current, constantly trying to get somewhere, we can finally relax and float downstream, going with the flow of life. And when we become free of the egoic self, we come home to our true nature as the awareness that is the source of all things. We come home to peace, joy, and love. And we can rest easily in the embrace of the divine. Well, thanks for watching. Please be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in our next video, all about the power of compassion.